The sun hung low over Silver Creek, bleeding its last gold across the dry land. Dust rose from the empty streets, swirling like ghosts that had nowhere else to go. The town was dying, the mines had closed, the cattle were thin, and men wandered the saloon like shadows chasing whiskey and memory. There were too many men and not enough hope. Or women. That was why the bride lottery had been born. It started as a joke, something the mayor's drunken cousin muttered one night when the saloon clock hit midnight. But a week later, the town council made it real. 10 men would be chosen, 10 women would volunteer, and each pair would be married by law the same day their names were drawn. A fair chance at a new life, the mayor had said. Better than dying alone. When Clara Hayes signed her name, her hand shook. She wasn't sure if she was choosing life or surrender. Once, she had been the daughter of a proud rancher with land stretching to the horizon. But a drought turned the grass to sand, and sickness took her father before the rains came back. Her mother followed soon after, leaving Clara with nothing but a worn Bible and a small trunk of clothes. She'd tried to find work in town, teaching, sewing, even cleaning, but there were more women than jobs and less kindness than anyone wanted to admit. So when the lottery was announced, she told herself it was fate's last invitation. If she refused, she'd have no roof, no food, and no name to keep her safe. But if she agreed, well, maybe God still had a plan. She stood among the other. Women in front of the town hall that morning, her blue dress faded at the hem, her hat shading trembling eyes. Men filled the street, rough-faced, sunburned, silent. The only sound was the creak of wagon wheels and the buzzing of flies around the rail. Miss Clara Hayes, the mayor's voice boomed, reading from a long paper. You've been paired with Mr. Eli Carter. The crowd stirred. A few women gasped. Some men whispered. Eli Carter was known by every ranch hand and outlaw for 50 miles, a man who lived alone on the far side of the canyon, rarely seen in town. They said he'd fought for the Union, though others swore he'd deserted. Some said he'd killed a man in a poker fight. Others said he just didn't talk because words had betrayed him too many times. Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had seen Eli only once before, years ago. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes so dark they looked carved from night itself. There had been something lonely about him even then, something unreachable. He stood at the back of the crowd now, hat tilted low, dust on his boots. When his name was read, he didn't flinch or smile. He simply walked forward, each step measured and silent. He stopped in front of her and looked down, not with hunger, not even curiosity, just quiet understanding. "Ma'am," he said softly, voice rough as dry riverbed gravel. Her throat tightened. "Mr. Carter." The mayor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, shall we make it official then?" The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. The preacher's words were familiar, but they felt heavy, like they were made of iron instead of air. When he said, "You may kiss your bride," Eli hesitated. Instead, he tipped his hat to her and murmured, "You'll have my name, ma'am. That's all I can give for now." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Around them, the townsfolk clapped, half-hearted and curious. To them, it was just another strange story to talk about over whiskey. But to Clara, it felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown arms of a man she didn't understand. When Eli offered his hand, she took it. His palm was calloused, warm, and sure. He led her toward the waiting horse hitched near the well. She climbed into the wagon beside him, clutching her trunk and the edge of her courage died as the wheels began to turn and the town disappeared behind a veil of dust. Clara glanced at Eli. He said nothing. He just kept his eyes on the horizon, the color of fading fire, where their future waited, silent and untamed. That was how her new life began, not with a kiss, but with the sound of hooves carrying her toward a stranger's world. Eli Carter's cabin stood miles from town, tucked between two canyons where the wind never stopped whispering. The journey from Silver Creek had been silent, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the restless snort of his horse, Whiskey. Clara had tried to speak once or twice, but the weight of his silence pressed heavier than words could fight against. When they reached his land, she saw what loneliness looked like when it was given shape: a crooked fence, a barn half collapsed from the last storm, and a cabin built from rough pine and solitude. No flowers, no porch swing, no warmth. Just emptiness that smelled of dust and old rain. Eli climbed down first, offered her a hand without meeting her eyes, and said simply, "This is home. Home." The word felt strange to her now. It had once meant laughter, the smell of stew simmering, her mother's humming voice in the kitchen. But here it was different. It was a graveyard of sound, still and waiting. Inside, the cabin was neat but bare. A single bed against the wall, a rough table, 2 chairs, a stove, and shelves filled with tools and bullets instead of books. A rifle leaned against the window. The air smelled faintly of smoke and leather. "You can take the bed," Eli said quietly. "I'll sleep out here for a while till things settle." She turned, startled. "That's not necessary, Mr. Carter. I'll be fine." He shook his head. "It's how it'll be for now. You need space to get used to things." His tone wasn't unkind, just final. Clara wanted to protest but saw something in his eyes. Not rejection, but restraint. This was a man who had built walls not out of pride, but out of survival. She nodded instead. "Thank you." He tipped his hat slightly and went back outside, disappearing into the evening. She watched through the window as he worked, unhooking the horse, checking the corral, moving with a kind of weary rhythm that told her he'd done it alone for years. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the land in red and gold, she felt the first twinge of fear. What if this was all her life would be now, a ghost wife to a man who didn't speak, who didn't smile, who carried some sorrow too? Deep for her to reach? When Eli came in at dusk, he brought firewood and a small sack of beans. He nodded at her cooking pot. "You cook?" "I do," she said softly. "Used to feed 6 ranch hands. Then you'll do fine here." His voice was low, almost like an apology. She stirred the beans while he sat at the table, mending a saddle strap. In the flicker of lamplight, she studied him quietly. His face was lean, tanned deep by sun and wind. A thin scar ran from his jaw to his neck, and his hands were rough, scarred, steady. There was something in him both strong and broken, like a tree that had survived too many storms but still stood tall. After a while she asked, "You don't talk much, do you?" He looked up briefly, one corner of his mouth lifting just a little. "Talk don't fix much." "Sometimes it helps," she said gently. "Not for me," he murmured, eyes dropping back to his work. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty this time. It hummed with things unsaid, 2 strangers learning the edges of each other's loneliness. When they finished eating, Eli stood, stretched, and took his blanket to the corner of the room. "You take the bed," he said again. She hesitated. "Good night, Mr. Carter." He paused, then replied, "Eli. You can call me Eli." She smiled faintly. "Good night, Eli." He didn't look back, but something softened in his shoulders before he lay down. That night, Clara lay awake, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing across the room. The sound was strange but comforting. It was the first night she hadn't been alone in a long time, and though they barely knew each other, something unspoken began to take root, fragile and hesitant, like the first green shoot pushing through dry soil after the rain. Eli Carter didn't know it yet, but the woman fate had handed him in a lottery was about to change everything he thought he'd buried. The day of the wedding in Silver Creek had arrived, but it was far from the romantic visions Clara had once held as a child. There were no lace veils, no soft music, no ribbons fluttering in the wind. Just a makeshift altar in the town square, dust swirling in the hot morning air, and the murmurs of neighbors who had come to witness the bride, lottery's latest match. Clara adjusted the brim of her faded blue hat and felt the weight of every eye on her. Women whispered behind their fans or kerchiefs, their voices sharp with curiosity or jealousy. Men tipped their hats or stared openly, some with approval, some with suspicion. Among them, Clara spotted Eli, tall, broad, silent, standing slightly apart from the crowd as though he belonged to a different world. His dark eyes scanned the square, not in arrogance but in quiet calculation. And when they met hers for a brief moment, she felt the strange weight of recognition. He saw her, but only just enough to keep her from vanishing into the dust like so many other things in his life. The preacher, an elderly man with a voice that cracked as easily as the wood of the pulpit, began the ceremony. He spoke words of union, of fidelity, of love, but to Clara they sounded hollow, almost absurd. She glanced at Eli, whose posture remained rigid, as if the words had no power to touch him. And yet, when his hand brushed against hers, there was a small shock of warmth, a silent acknowledgment that despite his silence, he was aware of her presence, of her fear, her hope, her fragility. "Do you, Clara Hayes, take Eli Carter to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the preacher asked. Clara's throat tightened. She nodded, her hands clasped tightly together, voice caught in her chest. Yes, she wanted to say, but it came out as a trembling nod. "And do you, Eli Carter, take Clara Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Eli's voice was low, gravelly, barely more than a whisper. "I do." It wasn't a vow filled with passion or joy, but it was honest. For a moment, Clara felt a strange relief. At least he hadn't refused her, hadn't mocked her. He had said the words, and in the law of men, that was enough to make her his dot. The moment of the kiss was awkward. Eli did not lean forward. He did not close his eyes. Instead, he tipped his hat toward her and murmured, almost inaudibly, "You'll have my name, ma'am. That's all I can offer for now." Clara's heart fluttered in confusion. It was not the kiss she had dreamed of as a girl, nor the warmth she had imagined in quiet, private moments. But there was something in the restraint, something that spoke of the man he was, a man who carried his past like a heavy pack, who had given so little because he feared loss, pain, and disappointment. The townsfolk clapped politely, some out of tradition, some out of relief that the ceremony was over. Clara barely noticed them. She was aware only of Eli's presence beside her, the strength in his frame, and the strange tension of a man who had chosen to keep the world at arm's length, yet somehow let her step inside, if only a little, after the ceremony. As the townsfolk dispersed with whispers and sideways glances, Eli guided her to the wagon. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Clara kept her gaze forward, trying to memorize every detail of the dusty streets, the sun-bleached boards of the saloon, the cracked signs of storefronts. She knew this would be the last she saw of the town for a while. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice trembling with anticipation and fear. Eli didn't answer immediately. He simply swung himself onto the wagon, gestured for her to sit, and started the horse forward. The wheels groaned over the hard-packed dirt road. "Home," he said finally, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man who had built a fortress around himself and now, unwillingly, had a companion to share it. Clara stared at him. The word home felt foreign yet strangely comforting. She did not know this man. She did not know what awaited her at the end of the road. But for the first time in years, she had somewhere to go, a place where her fate was intertwined with someone else's dot as the wagon rumbled away from Silver Creek. Dust curling in their wake, Clara realized that her life had changed in ways she could not yet understand. The bride lottery had given her a husband she did not want, and yet, somehow, perhaps it had given her something more profound, a chance at survival, a chance at love, and a chance at discovering the man beneath the silence. The road to Eli Carter's cabin was nothing more than a rough track cut into the red earth, winding between cliffs that rose like silent sentinels. Clara clutched her trunk tightly on the wagon seat, her knuckles white, heart thudding with a mix of fear and curiosity. She had no idea what awaited her at the end of this lonely trail, only that it would be far from the familiar streets of Silver Creek. When the cabin came into view, she understood exactly what loneliness looked like. It was a small, rough-hewn structure, its timbers weathered by wind, sun, and years of neglect. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in the otherwise desolate land. Surrounding it were a few lean horses tied to a post, a broken corral, and a half-collapsed barn leaning against the rocky hillside. The silence of the desert stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow. Eli climbed down from the wagon, his boots kicking up dust as he moved with a practiced ease. He offered her a hand, not with ceremony, not with warmth, but with a quiet certainty that she could trust him enough to take it. "This is home," he said simply, his eyes scanning the cabin as if he were already imagining the chores that awaited him tomorrow. Clara stepped down, her dress brushing against the dry earth. She took in every detail: the cracked wooden door, the uneven roof, the small window that looked out over a canyon glowing orange in the fading sunlight. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. A single bed sat in the corner, a rough table and 2 chairs occupied the center, and a stove that had seen better days rested against the wall. Shelves held nothing but tools, a few cans of beans, and a worn rifle leaning against the window. It smelled of smoke, leather, and solitude. "You take the bed," Eli said, his voice low and measured. "I'll sleep out here for a while." Clara blinked, startled. "Out here?" She gestured toward the sparse corner where he planned to lie. I can share it." "No," he interrupted gently but firmly. "It's how it'll be for now. You'll need space to get used to things." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. There was no anger in his tone, no cruelty, only the weight of someone who had spent years learning to survive alone. Someone who had built walls around himself so high that no one could scale them, not even fate. Eli went outside, leaving her to unpack her few belongings and make the cabin feel less like a prison. Clara moved slowly, placing her trunk on the bed and arranging the meager clothes inside. She cleaned the table, swept the floor, and lit a small oil lamp, illuminating the shadows that clung to the corners. Despite its barrenness, she found a strange comfort in the cabin. It was honest. It did not pretend to be anything it was not, and perhaps that was the closest thing to home she had felt in years. As dusk fell, Eli returned, carrying firewood and a small sack of beans. He set them on the table without a word and began stacking the wood for the stove. The silence between them was neither awkward nor heavy. It was a quiet acknowledgment, a bridge built from shared survival rather than conversation. Clara stirred the beans over the small fire, glancing at him occasionally. He was tall, broad-shouldered, hands calloused and scarred, face shadowed beneath a thick jawline and dark hair. Every motion spoke of a life spent outdoors, of hard work and solitude. She realized that she had never seen a man so capable, yet so guarded. Finally, she spoke. "You don't talk much, do you?" He looked up briefly, expression unreadable. "Talk don't fix much." "Sometimes it helps," she replied softly. "Not for me," he said, returning to his work. Night fell, and the cabin grew cold. Eli lay down in the corner with his blanket, leaving her the bed. Clara lay awake, listening to the wind whistling through cracks in the walls, the creak of the wooden floor as the cabin settled. And somewhere in that silence, a fragile sense of safety began to grow. For the first time since the lottery, she felt the faint stirrings of hope in the shadows of his cabin. Amidst the dust, sweat, and wind, two strangers began the slow, quiet dance of learning each other, a dance that would soon grow into something neither had dared to imagine. The first night at Eli Carter's cabin was quiet, almost painfully so. Clara had settled into the narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, dark and silent, broken only by the occasional distant howl of a coyote. The air was still, heavy with the promise of the night, but the desert was never truly still. Around midnight, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls, rattling the loose shutters. A low, distant rumble of thunder rolled across the canyon, and Clara stirred, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She had seen storms before, but none like this. The way the desert sky seemed to open up, swallowing the stars, painting everything in flashes of fire and shadow. The first bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating Eli as he stepped inside. Coat soaked, hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't speak at first. He simply moved with a practiced ease, closing the door against the wind, securing the shutters, and lighting the stove. Clara watched him, astonished at his calm in the chaos. Are you all right?" she asked, voice small. Eli glanced at her, his dark eyes catching the light of the storm outside. "It's just a storm," he said, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his concern. "Ain't nothing to worry about." She shook her head. "I'm worried. I've never been out here when it's like this. The wind, the lightning." Her voice trembled. Eli stepped closer, his presence filling the small room. "You ain't got to be afraid," he said, his voice low but firm. He reached out and took her hands, rough and calloused against her soft skin. "I got you." There was a vulnerability in his tone that Clara hadn't heard before, a crack in the armor of a man who had spent years building walls around himself. For the first time, she saw Eli not as the silent, stoic cowboy she had met, but as a human being, raw and real, fighting the same fears she carried in her chest. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the cabin in sharp, fleeting bursts. The wind howled like a living creature, rattling the roof and shaking the walls. Clara leaned into Eli instinctively, feeling the strength in his arms, the heat of his body, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time since the lottery, she felt a glimmer of safety. Eli didn't pull away. Instead, he wrapped his coat around her shoulders, guiding her to sit near the stove. The warmth of the fire seeped into her frozen fingers, and the two of them sat in silence, listening to the storm's fury. Occasionally, Eli would murmur a practical instruction: secure the window, stack the firewood closer, but mostly he stayed quiet, letting her sense the steady presence of someone who could weather the storm with her. Hours passed. The thunder grew louder, closer, and the rain began to lash against the cabin walls. Clara shivered, but Eli didn't let go of her hands. "Storms pass," he said finally, almost to himself. "Always pass." She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his in the firelight. There was something unspoken there, something deeper than fear or gratitude. In that brief, suspended moment, Clara felt the first real connection with the man she had been forced to marry, not a romantic gesture yet, but a shared recognition of vulnerability and trust. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to two people, two hearts quietly bracing against the chaos outside. And though neither spoke the words aloud, both understood the unspoken truth. They had survived the first storm together. And that was the beginning of something neither of them could have anticipated. By dawn, The desert lay drenched in a pale, washed-out light. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and a quiet hush of renewal. Clara woke to find Eli already outside, checking the horses, his coat still damp. His expression unreadable but softer than the night before. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air sharp and clean. The sun rose slowly over the red cliffs, casting long shadows across Eli Carter's cabin. Clara had stayed awake most of the night, listening to the rain pelt the roof and the wind whip through the canyon. But now, with the dawn softening the world, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Eli was already outside, feeding Whiskey and the other horses, his movements deliberate and steady. He didn't notice her at first, or perhaps he simply didn't care. She watched him quietly, studying the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head as he worked. He was a man of few words, but every motion carried the weight of someone who had survived too much and trusted too little. Eventually, the warmth of the sun coaxed her outside. She carried a small pot of coffee and set it near the fire pit, hoping he might notice. He glanced at it briefly, a shadow of a smile flickering across his lips. "Coffee?" he asked, voice low, more a statement than a question. "Yes," she replied softly. "Thought it might help after last night." He accepted the cup with a nod, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he took it from her. They sat together in silence, the firelight dancing across their faces, the smoke curling upward toward the clear blue sky. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. A quiet space where two people could exist without pretense or fear. After a long moment, Clara ventured carefully, "Eli, do you ever talk about yourself?" He snorted lightly, almost bitterly. "Ain't much to talk about. Life happens, people leave, you get used to it." "Used to it?" she asked, leaning closer, curious despite herself. He looked away, staring into the fire. "Used to losing things. People I cared about. Don't mean nothing to anyone, but I reckon it's the way it goes." Her chest tightened. There was pain in his words, a raw honesty that cut deeper than any polite conversation. "I've lost things too," she said quietly. "People I thought would always be there. Family, home, safety. And now I'm supposed to marry a man I barely know." Eli's eyes flicked toward her, dark and unreadable, but there was a flicker, a recognition. "Ain't much different for me," he said after a long pause. "Married life. Wasn't exactly my choice, neither. But I reckon some things you just gotta do, even if it scares you." She swallowed hard, realizing that beneath his rough exterior was a man who had carried more loneliness than most could imagine. She reached out, hesitating only a moment before brushing a strand of wet hair from his forehead. Her fingers lingered, tracing the line of his scar with gentle curiosity. Eli's gaze dropped to her hand, then slowly to her eyes. He didn't move away. Instead, he allowed the touch, something inside him softening in a way that he hadn't allowed anyone to see in years. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the crisp morning air. Clara spoke softly, almost to herself. "You don't have to be so alone, you know? Even if it's just me. I'm here." Eli's voice was low, almost breaking. "Stop me when I go too deep," he whispered, not meeting her eyes. Her heart skipped a beat. She understood the weight behind the words. A man who feared his own emotions, who had lived in silence so long that opening himself even slightly felt like drowning. She didn't stop him. Instead, she offered him a smile, quiet and steady. "You don't have to stop," she said gently. "Not with me." For the first time, Eli allowed himself to feel something other than duty or solitude. Something warm, something dangerous in its honesty, something that hinted at the life he hadn't dared to imagine. He looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. And for the first time, Clara saw not just the cowboy, but the man behind the scars, the loneliness, the silence. The two of them sat in the glow of the fire, talking in small fragments, sharing moments they had never shared with anyone. And though the words were few, their meaning was immense, a fragile bridge between two souls who had both known loss, pain, and isolation, and who were now beginning to find each other. That morning, in the quiet aftermath of a storm, a slow and hesitant trust began to grow, a spark that promised warmth, connection, and maybe, just maybe, something that resembled love. The days following the storm passed in a quiet rhythm that Clara had begun to understand. Mornings were spent tending to the horses and cooking breakfast, afternoons helping Eli with chores, and evenings sitting by the fire as the desert sun bled into the horizon. Words were scarce, but each glance, each gesture, carried weight. They were two souls navigating a fragile new connection, testing the waters of trust without knowing what lay beneath. That evening, after a long day of mending fences and repairing the barn, Eli and Clara sat by the fire pit outside the cabin. The wind had softened to a gentle whisper, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. Smoke curled lazily from the fire, casting flickering shadows across their faces. Clara stirred the coals absent-mindedly, watching sparks rise and disappear into the night. Eli sat across from her, his eyes dark and reflective, hands clasped loosely in his lap. The silence stretched, but it was no longer awkward. It was a shared space, heavy with anticipation and unspoken thoughts. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "Eli, do you ever think about what it might be like to have someone with you? Someone you care about?" Her voice was soft, tentative, almost afraid of the answer. Eli's jaw tightened. He didn't answer immediately, only stared into the fire. "Ain't much point in thinking about it," he murmured. "People. They leave, Clara, always leave." "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, leaning a little closer. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. I won't." For a moment, his gaze met hers. There was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, something raw and unguarded that startled her. The firelight danced across his strong features, highlighting the lines of hardship etched into his face, the faint scar along his jaw. Clara realized in that moment how deeply loneliness had shaped him and how profoundly it had made him human. Eli's voice dropped to a near whisper, almost trembling. "Stop me if I go too far." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She understood what he meant, a warning, a plea, and a confession all at once. She didn't move away. Instead, she reached out, placing her hand over his, feeling the rough, scarred surface of his palm. "You won't," she said softly. "I want this, Eli. With you?" The air seemed to hum with electricity, charged by the fire and the quiet desert night. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Eli leaned closer. Clara's breath caught in her throat as their faces drew near. He paused, searching her eyes for permission, for reassurance, for a tether in a world where he had learned to trust nothing. She offered him a small, steady smile. "I'm here." That was all he needed. His lips met hers in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and trembling with emotion. It was not the passionate, fiery kiss of novels or dreams. It was raw, real, and full of years of longing neither had dared to voice. Every nerve in Eli's body seemed to come alive, every ounce of restraint giving way to the truth he had kept buried. He wanted her. Not as a duty, not as a consequence of a lottery, but as someone he had chosen, however quietly. Clara responded with equal tenderness, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the rough fabric of his shirt. There was hesitation, yes, but also trust, a fragile surrender that neither had ever given another. The kiss deepened slowly, unhurried. A silent promise of connection, of understanding, of something neither of them could yet name. When they finally pulled away, both were breathless, the fire casting golden light on flushed cheeks. Eli's dark eyes, usually guarded, were open and raw, filled with an intensity Clara had never seen before. You didn't stop me," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "No," she said softly, smiling. "Not with me." For the first time, Eli allowed himself to exhale, to let the walls around his heart crack open ever so slightly. The desert night stretched out around them, vast and quiet, but for the first time, neither felt alone. That kiss, simple yet profound, marked the beginning of something neither had dared hope for. A bridge between two lonely hearts finding each other in a world that had long taught them to survive alone. The first light of dawn spilled over the canyon ridges, painting the desert in soft gold and rose. Clara woke to the quiet hum of the cabin, the faint crackle of the fire, the distant rustle of horses outside, and the rhythm of Eli's breathing in the corner where he had slept. She had expected awkwardness after the previous night, a tension born of uncertainty and newly stirred emotions, but instead there was only the steady, grounding presence of him. She lay for a moment, watching him sleep. His jaw was relaxed, the scar along his cheek softened in the morning light. He looked almost vulnerable, something she hadn't seen before. Years of solitude, scars from battle, and the weight of life's hardships were still there, but behind them was a man who had let someone in, even if only for a moment. Her heart ached with a strange tenderness for him, and a quiet warmth spread through her chest. Careful not to wake him, she slipped out of the bed and padded to the window. Outside, the desert was alive in its morning stillness. The horses grazed. The air smelled of sage and wet earth from last night's storm, and the canyon walls glowed with a warmth that made her heart feel lighter than it had in years. Eli stirred and opened one eye, catching her glance. "Morning," he said, voice low, hoarse from sleep. "Morning," she replied softly, offering a small smile. He swung his legs off the bed and stretched, the motion slow and deliberate, as if testing the world after a long night of isolation. He glanced toward the horses, then back at her. "Coffee?" he asked, his tone neutral, but she noticed a flicker of care beneath it. "Yes," she said. Walking toward the small stove to put the pot on, they moved around each other with a quiet familiarity that hadn't existed before. She poured the coffee into 2 chipped mugs and set one in front of him. He accepted it with a nod, his fingers brushing hers briefly, a touch that sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. They sat together outside, the fire pit still smoldering, the desert stretching endlessly around them. Neither spoke immediately, content in the comfort of shared silence. Clara watched Eli study the horizon, his eyes dark and thoughtful, and realized that the man who had seemed so closed off was slowly letting pieces of himself show, small, subtle pieces, like cracks in a wall revealing the warmth within. Finally, she spoke, testing the fragile intimacy that had begun. "Last night, it wasn't wrong," she said carefully. "It was right, in a way I didn't expect." Eli's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then slowly he nodded. "Ain't easy, letting anyone in," he admitted. "Don't make it simple for me. But last night, you didn't make me run away." Clara felt a swell of hope. "You don't have to run," she said softly. "Not from me." He looked back to the horizon, running a hand through his hair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I reckon I didn't know someone could stay," he murmured. "You'll see," she said, smiling gently. "I'm not going anywhere." The desert around them seemed to hold its breath. the canyon silent except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the creak of a tree branch swaying in the morning breeze. In that quiet, tentative moment, they didn't need words to understand each other. Trust had begun to weave between them, fragile but strong. Like new shoots pushing through cracked earth after a long drought. Eli finally sipped his coffee, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Didn't reckon I'd ever want someone around," he murmured. "But you changed that." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "I didn't win you, Eli," she said gently. "You found me." For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile, slow and genuine. The morning sun bathed them in gold, and for a brief, perfect moment, the loneliness that had defined both of their lives seemed to lift, replaced by the fragile, unspoken promise of something new, hope, connection, and maybe finally, love.